This is Lecture 2, Part 3, and in this Part 3 of 3, so the last screencast of Lecture 2, dealing with problems and consequences associated with hearing loss. I'm going to first talk about problems associated with an adult with adult-onset hearing loss, and then talk about problems specific to a child. As I've sort of mentioned to you already over these last couple of screencasts, the population of persons with hearing impairment is very heterogeneous. There are many subgroups within persons who have hearing impairment. To make it sort of digestible for us and to make it more practical, we're really only going to feature and focus on a couple of the main groups, of the main subgroups of this sort of larger population of persons with hearing loss. So primarily we're going to be talking about adults with adult-onset hearing loss, presumably persons who had had hearing within normal limits for most of their life and then incurred hearing loss due to aging or trauma or noise exposure, etc. And then also we're going to talk about problems associated with children because of the common associated developmental issues that hearing loss would impose on them. But there are many other groups that subgroups that may be defined by pathology, other categories that we'll talk about possibly as we go through the course. The first group I want to deal with, though, is just persons, adults with adult-onset hearing loss. Now, one of the main features that you'd have to consider with an adult with adult-onset hearing loss is that this is going to be a social problem, that this is going to be something that the hearing impairment is going to impose social limitations on that person and on their family and on their activities in their community. So adult-onset hearing loss is first and foremost sort of a social type of problem. For an adult that's still working, it's going to cause potentially vocational vulnerability. So ultimately it does get down to that idea of lifestyle, work style. And when hearing loss imposes a vocational vulnerability, it becomes very serious because now the person's livelihood and their family and their economic survival is at risk. Additionally, adult-onset hearing loss has the possibility of causing additional psychological and emotional consequences. So, as we had said earlier, the notion of early identification, early intervention, even for an adult with adult-onset hearing loss, would imply that the sooner that you recognize and remedy a problem, or at least address a problem perhaps, the more likely you're going to be able to reduce anything that's consequent. Well, for adult with adult-onset hearing loss, we're typically, again, it would be psychological and emotional consequences, again, not only for them, but also as that affects their family members and what we might call their frequent communicative partner, or their FCP. So again, the earlier that the adult accepts the condition and takes positive action toward overcoming it, the more likely that they're going to do better. Their prognosis and their families will be better. A point to recall, and again, there's an article that I have you looking at for this group of articles, is by a guy named Ingrau. So in the November-December 2013, I think, issue of the Hearing Loss magazine, but look at the Moodle for the correct citation, please. It talks about quality of life and points out to us that we really should be measuring quality of life, health, hearing-related health quality of life measures. So it's something that, again, when we talked about the changes, challenges rather, of facing oral rehab, one of them was accountability, and this would also deal with quality of life. If hearing loss is a quality of life issue, then the benefits associated with hearing aid amplification and any other intervention that we would utilize in oral rehabilitation should therefore logically be measured with quality of life measures. And Ingrau does a reasonable job at talking about some of these basic tests that are used for quality of life. So again, that basic premise there. Now, let's move on to conclude Lecture 2 by looking at just a couple of slides that outline now problems specific to a child. So when we think about a child, again, our major focus is going to be a child that's prelingual or perilingual. So we're talking about a child who is in the process of developing speech and spoken language. And so again, a child who would be postlingual, a child that might incur hearing impairment, say, approximately age 5 or so, probably is going to have a very different prognosis than a child who is born with hearing loss. So very different. So let me outline this little sequence here. Here's what, again, especially for a child who has hearing loss in their very first years of their life, whether it was present at birth or early in life. That part so much doesn't matter. It's the fact that it's during the development of language. That is what the key is. Here's what hearing loss does, just to kind of break it down. If you can't hear completely well, that's going to mean that you're going to have an inability or a reduction in the ability to receive and to be able to hear all sounds in your environment. So children with hearing loss will not hear all acoustic events. The consequence of that is they're not going to be able to have a functional perception of the space around them, and that means that they're going to likely have sound localization abilities. Although we didn't talk about it in the screencasts to date, one of the points that I make when I teach my hearing science class is that one of the fundamental animal level behaviors that hearing provides to animals, including a human animal, talking animals, is the ability to tell where sound's coming from. The ability to tell where sound is coming from is implicit upon having an intact pair of ears. So if you're unable to hear sounds, you're not going to be able to tell where they're going to be coming from, and that's going to cause a child that's going to appear to be inattentive, because they're not going to be able to tell auditorily and quickly where something is coming from. So they'll have to visually scan the environment, and in so doing, they're going to appear to be sort of inattentive or looking around or something. So that would be absolutely wrong to make that conclusion. Additionally, if you can't hear sound and you can't recognize the sound, you're not going to be able to associate sounds with events. So you're not going to be able to make sort of cause and effect kinds of relationships that children typically are doing as they're learning language. And again, all of these three things here now lead to challenges in learning an acoustic-based language system. And that's exactly what speech is. Speech is just simply a set of acoustic codes, acoustic signals that encode language. And so failing the ability to hear those sounds, it's going to present significant challenges in using sound to create a language system using acoustic cues. The implications, and we could sort of combine the previous points from slide 22 and just say, well, we can just say all of the above there is considered to be what we would refer to as auditory deprivation. So a child is absent acoustic stimulation, is absent therefore the ability to make those connections of sounds to events and to be able to utilize sound to produce a spoken language system. If that's the case, then there's a devastating cascade of implications that follow auditory deprivation. If you're unable, as we left off in slide 22, or if you have a challenged acoustic-based language system, if that was your only language system, and if you have no functional language system, that is highly problematic, because that in turn will lead to emotional adjustments and emotional issues, which in turn is going to lead to social isolation, which then is going to contribute to academic learning difficulties, which reduces educational achievement and provides educational vulnerability, which in turn leads to vocational achievement vulnerabilities, and then ultimately gets us back down to reduced quality of life. Again, all of this due to really the lack of a functional communication system, which in turn was lack of lack of access. So no access to the sounds of language. And all of that then in turn leads to all of this stuff. Continuing on with some other challenges and problems specific to a child, would just a couple quick reminders is that the family is also affected. Families include parents as well as siblings. Siblings, in my view, are almost always underestimated in terms of the effect and the consequences of having their sibling having special needs. There's almost always then lack of or diminished care, diminished attention. It's a family has to be very, very careful to provide the services that are needed for their child with special needs, without sort of minimizing their other children. So it's a challenge. It's a very difficult balancing act. But point being is that the family, parents and siblings are affected. Point number 7 here: parents have to make choices. And one of the choices that they're going to have to make, and we'll spend some time sort of alongside them kind of considering in this class, is through what modality is my child going to learn a communication system? And so we'll talk about how they may kind of go about doing that. The problem is that there's very little evidence that is very clear-cut. So even in our era of evidence-based practice, there's going to be very little evidence to date that's really significantly supportive of one way to learn a spoken language versus others. Another thing to appreciate at point 8 is that a child's auditory capacities, their actual hearing abilities, are probably not going to be really fully captured until age 4 years of age. Up until then, audiometric findings may be appear to be variable. They may appear to be progressive or drifting or something, but likely it just simply is a lack of alignment with what the child's sophistication and what we're able to do audiologically. All of the above suggests that there's going to be costs to the person, to the family, and to society relative to the hearing status of that child. Finally, then, in conclusion here in Lecture 2, understand that parents and families are going to have to make choices. As providers, we have to respect those choices, even if sometimes we don't agree, and even if we have a bias about one particular approach versus others. Finally, we have to understand that earliest possible identification and intervention is critical, as that's going to minimize or prevent any associated or other unnecessary problems. On that point, we'll conclude Lecture 2.